Someone travelling on the Norfolk Broads, as I was a couple of weeks ago, will soon find there are no end of things to look out for, from the abundance of reeds to boats of all kinds, a wide range of wildlife, even if I was not a good enough cameraman to capture much of what I saw for you, and of course the buildings that have sprung up along the waterside, from the grand to the interesting, and of course the many old windmills, once used to pump water from the surrounding land, most of which now stand empty, long replaced by electrical alternatives. It is truly a very peaceful place to take a short break, although at times it did feel more like I was on the Mississippi than the River Brure. But as you round one of the corners on the River Brure, near the entrances to the River Ant and the River Thurn, a rather peculiar building comes into view. This is what remains of St. Benet's Abbey, a building that once dominated the area and stood as a place of worship for hundreds of years, and at times still does. A place where myth mixes with fact, and today has a rather strange appearance that will be explained very shortly. The exact origins of the settlement are hard to pin down, but an anonymous source from the 14th century claims that a Christian hermit named Schumann built a small chapel dedicated to St. Benedict in around 800 AD, on what at the time, due to the height of the water in the area, was an island called Cowholm. He soon gained a following of others who came to worship and live with him. This small community would last for around 50 to 70 years, until from the North Sea the Danes descended upon Norfolk and soon found the area. In the ensuing raids, the chapel was destroyed and Schumann was killed. In his death, Schumann became somewhat of a martyr, leading to a new hermit named Wulfric, coming to the site in the 10th century and bringing with him 10 companions to restart the community that would slowly grow over time. By 1019, they had become somewhat known in the area, which led to them being granted permission by King Canute to take ownership of the land and build an abbey for them to live and worship in. The construction of St. Benet's began. Named for St. Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, the king had heard of the hermits while staying just down the river in Horning. King Canute would also take monks from this abbey to set up the abbey in Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, and this would be the start of a long-running relationship between the two abbeys, where they would exchange manpower and books whenever needed, even going as far as St. Benet's, offering protection to several monks from Bury St. Edmunds when they were attacked by locals in 1326 and were in need of shelter. St. Benet's would not just be the first Benedictine monastery in Norfolk, but is the only monastery in Norfolk founded in the Anglo-Saxon period, which continued throughout the Middle Ages. The original structure was built from a mix of mud and wood, but this began to be replaced with stone under the watch of the abbey's first abbot, a man known as Elysian. The process of replacing the mud and wood with stone was an operation that must have been a huge undertaking for the day, and by no means a cheap affair. Much of the stone used could not be found in the local area and had to be shipped to the location. Elysian would not live to see his work of the abbey complete, with the final stone being laid under the supervision of the abbey's second abbot, a man named Thurston, who would run the place until his death in 1064, being laid to rest in the abbey in the chapel of St. Michael's. The 5th of January 1066 brought a crisis to the whole kingdom. King Edward the Confessor died without an heir, and soon a power struggle for his throne began. Harold Godwinson, his brother-in-law, was the first to act, proclaiming himself king and being crowned the next day as Harold II. But by the end of the year, not one but 2 invasion forces had come to take it from him. Coming from the north was Harold Hardrada of Norway, and from the south, William of Normandy. Around this time, the abbot of St. Benet's was placed in charge of the defence of East Anglia by the king, and along with other abbeys in England, was expected to provide the king with the funds for warships and to raise an army of men. In the end, their warships mattered little. Despite successes against Harold Hardrada in the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September 1066, King Harold was killed just 2 weeks later in the battle against William in the south of England at Hastings. And with no real challengers left, William was king. And it's here, shortly after the Norman conquest, comes the rather grisly origin of the Abbey's resident ghost story. At this time, there was a young monk in residence, known as Esric, who saw his future as much more than just one of quiet worship. He fancied himself as a perfect replacement for the current abbot. He conspired with the invaders and led them to the abbey, with promises that in return he would get what he thought he deserved. The Normans agreed, and after he had thrown open the gates and let them in, he was proclaimed abbot on the spot. But only moments after the ceremony ended, the Normans gave him what they thought he deserved. The Normans had little respect for traitors with ambitions, as they were generally as likely to turn on them as they had been to conspire with them. Esric was dragged from his abbot's throne and nailed to the door of the abbey's main gate and skinned alive, although some other sources claim he was simply hanged on the spot. But ever since then, as the story goes, his screams of agony have echoed down the centuries, especially on the night of the 25th of May, the anniversary of his death, and at times a ghostly apparition that has come to be called the Shrieking Monk is seen wandering around the old gatehouse. The Abbey's relationship with the country's new rulers would only worsen when in 1075 one of their biggest patrons, Ralph Gerda, Earl of East Anglia, led other earls in open revolt against King William. The revolt was swiftly crushed. The Earl of East Anglia lost his position and his land, and all those connected with him fell into great suspicion. For the Abbey, this would lead to a long period of harassment from locals who had sided with William, encroaching on their land, and several of their timber buildings were simply dismantled and stolen during the night. This would carry on even after William's death, into the reign of Henry II, who commanded it to stop. Despite this, the Abbey would keep its power, and over the next 200 years gained more power and influence. And in 1101, now run by Abbot Ralph, began new constructions, this time of a western tower that contained two large bells. There would be several expansions and refurbishments done to the location, but the majority of the work had been completed by 1274. And although, for where its size and its location, St Benet's was doing rather well, but there was one thing the Abbey lacked compared to many others across the country: a shrine to a local or general saint. The monks had tried to bring this into reality, but nothing had ever really got off the ground. First, they claimed to have relics dating back to the Abbey's founders, as Sherman and Wulfric. When this failed, they turned their attention to St Margaret of Holm, a local woman killed in 1170, and was buried near the high altar in the Abbey. But other than a bit of a local cult that came up for a time, her story never took off and few pilgrims came. The location may be faring well against the ravages of man and of time, but its greatest challenge was nature. It found itself flooded several times due to heavy rain and to sea flooding, and in 1287 they were forced to abandon their stables and keep the horses in the nave of the church for a time when they were completely submerged. But by 1291 they had ownership of 28 churches, property in 76 parishes, as well as the right to dig peat in 12 of them. A valuable thing to have, peat digging was the lifeblood of the Broads. And for those who are not aware, the Norfolk Broads, as we see them today, are not a natural creation. They were created by medieval and later peat digging. They were used as an alternative to firewood when dried out, and was the main commerce of the area. The site of the Abbey itself also grew to cover over 30 acres of land that included stables, farms and fishing ponds, with the remnants of the fishing ponds there today being the finest example of medieval fishing ponds found anywhere in England. And in total they were taking in an annual income of £326, 4 shillings and 3 3/4 pence. This money came from rent paid by tenants. The rents were either paid to them directly if the person could afford it, or if they couldn't, they were paid by means of services rendered, either work done for the Abbey or the giving of livestock and commodities, such as chicken, sheep, beer for the monks to drink, even honey. All was accepted, and must have gone pretty far to keep the monks going, as the Abbey would never be a large one, never holding more than a couple of dozen monks at a time. But clearly it was not an arrangement that was universally loved by the locals, as in 1327 the Abbey requested and was granted royal permission to construct walls with battlements around the site to increase its defences, which before that had been made up of ditches with earthwork walls on 3 sides, and of course the river on a 4th. But now a new wall would run along all 4 sides, and it's probably very fortunate that they did. 1381 brought the famous Peasants' Revolt across the country. I will cover what happened in this region in better detail at some point in the future. But at St Benet's, an angry mob of local tenant farmers and other peasants marched on the Abbey, enraged by the amount of unpaid work they were required to do for the Abbey to keep their homes. They surrounded the gatehouse and forced their way in through the door, believing the local bishop was there. Fortunately for him, they discovered he was not. So they soon turned their attention to the Abbey's court rolls, legal documents such as deeds and grants and debts. They took them and set fire to them just in front of the gatehouse. Now, as far as they were concerned, forever destroying all details of their obligations and debts. But this was not to be, and the revolt was not to last long, and for those who survived its brutal putting down, they simply found the court rolls had now just been rewritten. The Abbey gained another patron who was destined to be remembered forever, although this time in fiction, Sir John Falstaff, the inspiration for Flagstaff, a character in William Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, where he is portrayed as fat, vain, boastful, selfish, and a coward. Proof, as there ever needs to be, there has always been artistic license taken with history. The real Falstaff was a capable knight who had served in France in the 100 Years' War, aided in the building of Caister Castle, and gave a good deal of money to St Benet's to help with construction of a new isle to the south, and for his generosity would find himself laid to rest within the Abbey walls in 1459 along with his wife. Life carried on as normal for the Abbey's inhabitants into the 1500s, now numbering around 23 monks, who spend much of their days in worship, while others, known as lay brothers, carried out much of the work, from cooking and farming to fishing in the monastery's fishing ponds. At this point, I can probably guess where you think this story is going, with the Abbey being destroyed on the orders of Henry VIII during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, along with over 700 others, during the split from the Catholic Church. But no, St Benet's was left untouched, the only abbey in England where this happened. What saved it when other, far richer abbeys fell? Most likely that it was fairly poor and largely out of the way. But a bit of luck came into it too, in the form of the death of Bishop Nix of Norwich in 1536. In need of a replacement, Henry appointed William Reggie, St Benet's abbot, to the position, in exchange for him handing over all his property to the crown and having to use the abbey's money to finance his bishophood. A rather unique position, but not one that would last very long. Within 5 years of taking over, William Reggie was forced to retire from the church, but I've been unable to find out what for. And although the abbey had been spared the wrath of the king, it was not long for this world. The fall of the Catholic Church in England led to many monks leaving the country, mostly for their own safety. Even the protected ones at St Benet's departed, and by 1545 the last of the monks had left England, and the abbey now lay abandoned. The destruction of the buildings to what you see now came from a pretty simple reason. The new Bishop of Norwich had debts that needed to be paid off, and stones, especially the flint used in the building, was incredibly valuable, and was soon being sold off to make up for the money needed. And effectively the abbey was recycled, used for other buildings, including the Duke of Norfolk's palace in Norwich, as well as many countless smaller village homes in the area. And it did not take long for the seat of power for over 500 years to be little more than a pile of stones by 1579. And from what I can tell, very little seems to have happened at the site for well over 100 years. Those of you who are thinking the rather strange newer building, constructed inside the former gatehouse, looks very much like a windmill, you are exactly right. It was built in 1725, making it the oldest windmill on the Broads, first built to crush oilseed, before later being converted into a water pump. Sadly, during this upgrading of the windmill, upper parts of the old gatehouse were demolished to allow the sails to turn more easily. It would remain in operation, pumping water from the nearby lands into the river, until 1863, when the sails were blown off in a storm, and it was subsequently left to fall apart. You may be wondering why, of all places in a largely untouched countryside, they had to construct a windmill, why you would build it directly into the ruins of the Abbey, and the answer is a pretty simple one. Where the Abbey stands is an elevated position that allowed the windmill to catch better wind than that in other areas. And on the site of the old Abbey, the windmill did not stand alone for very long either. Closer to the banks of the river was an inn, constructed using parts of the site's buildings and loose stones that were still around at the time, with the entrance to the tavern actually being a 14th century doorway. The inn was known as the Chequers, and it was in operation from the late 19th century until it was unfortunately demolished in 1907, removing even more of the site's history forever. And of course, the site of an old abbey may seem like a rather strange place to construct an inn. Where exactly was your trade coming from, other than a few passing wherry boats doing their work? Fortunately for the owners of the inn, they had far more clientele than just the hard-working Broadsmen who may stop in for the occasional drink. The rather unique look of the area had been a huge attraction to artists and creatives, and by the 19th century it was a well-known tourist destination, with many coming over land and by boat to look around. The site's future safety was sealed in 1925, when it was among the first added to the secluded monuments list of places of important historical value, thankfully protecting the ruins from any more demolishments or being recycled for other buildings. And this goes for the windmill as well. Today, both the Abbey and the windmill are listed, with the ruins being Grade 1 and the mill Grade 2. Another of the more striking imagery of the location that you will have seen with these pictures is the large wooden cross. This is marks where the Abbey's high altar once stood. It was gifted to the site by the Queen in 1987 and is made from an oak taken from the royal estate at Sandringham. The ground that St Benet stood on was in fact owned by the Crown for a period of time, running from 1993 to 2002, when it was sold to the Norfolk Archaeological Trust. But the ruins themselves were still the property of the church. They would sell the gatehouse to the trust in 2004, but the rest of the ruins they were not so keen to part with, but agreed to lease them to the trust for 199 years. As said before, despite its state, the Abbey is still in use by the church, and a special service is held each year on the first Sunday of August by the Bishop of Norwich, who still holds the title of the Abbot of St Benet's, the only bishop in the country to hold two titles of this kind. They are brought to the Abbey by river, standing on the bow of a wherry boat, from where they lead a procession up to the high altar to conduct their service. As well as this, in the modern day, it acts as a great place to spend some time and enjoy the sun and the local wildlife. And with it being a tourist location for so many years, the inside of the old mill is covered in countless names and dates carved into the stone from the past, and probably more than a few from present visitors as well. I'm sure there are far older ones, but at the time I was looking round in there, the two I found that really stood out to me was this one from someone going by the name of Keys, carved in 1910, although looking at it now that might say 1810, but in person it looked far more like the former. And this one, made by G. Talcott, on the 10th of June 1902, and what could be another Talcott below, possibly done later by another family member. The location celebrated its 1,000-year anniversary since the royal decree by King Canute in 2019, and played host to a whole range of plays and events held at the Abbey from the June to the September. Although this video is not one of this year's Halloween specials, and I do try to keep them as separate as I possibly can, in the course of my research I have found there are far too many strange and unnatural tales connected to the Abbey for me not to cover them. It seemed that the shrieking monk is far from alone. The ghost of another monastic brother, this one from some 500 years later, is said to row along the river with his dog, looking for the monks who left the area in the 1540s. Others have claimed to see the lingering spirits of the first hermits killed by the Danes there as well. And among the names carved into the stone are also several markings used to ward off evil spirits and witches. And possibly they are something to do with what I'm about to tell you, the strangest myth connected to the Abbey, the Dragon of London. The first thing interesting about this apparent creature is when it is said to have made an appearance. We are not talking about some distant date pre-Norman conquest. This dragon's reign of terror was in 1782. The good people of London were shocked by the appearance of a hideous monster. It was said to have resembled a dragon or monstrous lizard. It was covered with scales and had wings. Its frightful mouth was rendered formidable by tremendous teeth. It was supposed to measure from 12 to 15 feet in length. It only seemed to come out at night, forcing locals to stay in their homes after dark as it stalked the lanes, but was soon keen to disappear when the sun came up. After a great deal of searching, the locals found where the beast was coming from. A large burrow near the Carpenter's Arms just past the old schoolhouse. And so began a battle of attrition. For a period of time, the villagers would fill in the hole every morning, only for the dragon to burst out again in the evening. This went on until one day, to the horror of the local residents, the monster emerged in full daylight of an afternoon, seemingly wanting to sunbathe. While others ran in terror, one man snuck up to the burrow and pushed a large stone over the entrance. Some time later, the creature returned, but unable to get back underground or move the stone. The dragon flew into a rage and ran away towards the abandoned St. Benet's. Round and round it ran, throwing up stones and dirt in its fury, raising its hideous form up against the ruined walls. At last it entered the gloomy archway, where it is supposed to have made its way into the vaults beneath, and was no more seen. The newly dug hole was filled in with stones and dirt, and there are those that claim the unexplained beast still sleeps somewhere beneath the Abbey's ruins, with there even being claims that this wasn't really a dragon at all, but in fact the devil himself. I'm sorry that went a little bit off topic from what we normally cover, but I felt it was worth mentioning. If you ever find yourself on this part of the Norfolk Broads, I recommend a visit to the Abbey to look around. They even have guided tours there from time to time. Unfortunately, I can't be very helpful for you on how to find the location by land, as, much like the bishop, I came to the area by boat. I did see a sign for the village of London, but this was a 40-minute walk from the site, so I would strongly suggest, if you were going by other means, to do your own research first, to avoid getting there and being disappointed or unable to make the long walk. And of course, if you do wish to go by boat, there are plenty of places to stop and moor up at the Abbey and slightly further down if you have to. Again, I won't go into that. I'll leave that to you if you wanted to do it. Although there are definitely a few places I would recommend, but that will be a story for another day. There is far more history of St. Benet's that I'm sure I have missed. This was just to give you an overview of what I thought was a very interesting place, and I thought you may be interested as well. As in the future, I do hope to cover more histories of buildings themselves, so this was a little beginning of that. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was St. Benet's, Norfolk's oldest abbey, and this was a little bit of history.